Morning. This is the presentation for data on Rails. I am pulling together, hopefully with Ben Stansel. And here he is.
Howdy.
Good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet.
Yeah, good to meet.
All right. I have a little presentation I put together just to organize our time, and
Awesome.
starts out with introductions. So,
All right.
the three questions I always ask people when I meet them is, where were you born? What were you trained as? And what brings you here?
So I was born in North Carolina, in the US. Trained as math and econ, so I guess I'm probably closest to, like, an economist of sorts. That was where I started my professional career, was doing a bunch of economic research. What brings me here? I have no idea. A series of decisions that I don't know. It's the butterflies flapping their wings kind of stories. So I worked in DC, doing economic policy work for a long time, or not a long time, for a little bit of time. Then ended up getting a job in tech, mostly because I liked the type of thinking that went into that sort of work, but was working at like a think tank where you basically make policy recommendations to people who don't care.
I'd imagine consulting, it's very similar, except they pay you more.
Yeah, that's how I've described it. It's basically consulting, except your clients didn't hire you. You're just kind of doing it for free. And they care about as much as you'd expect for doing it for free. So started working in tech, basically doing, it's in a lot of ways similarly shaped work, just on like very different problems. And then ended up meeting some people there, starting Mode, and kind of the rest has been, now Mode has been a good bit of time. So
yeah. And I guess what brought us here was your blog post on Beyond SQL. So my version of that story, I was born in the US, just barely. My parents came over from India just before I was born. So I grew up bicultural. And as part of that, I always had a deep insecurity about my cultural identities, which I solved by studying physics. So I did 11 years of physics, and then decided that that was a waste of time and decided to do something else entirely. And so I ended up eventually at Apple. And what brings me here is that I was working there on open source and developer tools. And I did some research on programming languages, and suddenly had this epiphany about a completely different way to think about software, which I spent a few years trying to pitch at Apple. And when that failed, I left to go do a startup. And when that failed, I went to do a bunch of other startups, and that landed me here. And in particular, actually, that's enough. That's how I got here. And I think the rest will hopefully become clearer as we go through. So what I wanted to do is, I've been really pressing into this idea of data apps. And I was thinking, if we do nothing else, if we could define what that means and what it takes to get there, that would be interesting to me and possibly to others. And then I'll pitch you a crazy little thing I've been working on the side that might be a part of that answer.
Cool.
All right. So first thing is that so I was riffing on the idea of Ruby on Rails. Have you actually had much experience with Ruby on Rails, or you just kind of mentioned that in passing?
I have, yes, and so I'm not an engineer. I have built like a couple Rails apps, as like trying to understand how all this stuff works. And I have worked at companies that are both Node and my prior employer were Rails apps. Okay. And so I'm very familiar with like the code bases of those applications. I wouldn't say like, let me go develop on it, but I understand how it all works and things like that. So I have like a decent understanding, even though if you gave me a complicated Rails app and said, go fix it, I would be able to do some very basic stuff.
Right. And I've been around long enough, I feel like do you know any of the history of Rails or web development before all of that? Or is it just
yeah, like the broad strokes.
Okay, good. All right, cool. So, all right. So this is the kind of the manifesto I wanted to run by you and see if this matches your understanding. That in the future, every knowledge worker and team will have their own adaptive personalized console that is designed to help them understand, make, and implement decisions. And the idea is that, like, instead of having a sort of data-centric view of like, I got this data here, or this app here, or this vendor here, it's like what you really want is I just show up and like, this thing knows what I'm going to do and helps me do it. Is that congruent with your sense of a data app?
Yes, so yes, but maybe with depends on exactly how it's, I think, set up. My view of what a data app is the current way, and I was actually just talking to someone about this. The current terminology, I think, is wrong. Basically, a lot of people, I think, have started to define like a data app as what is a dashboard with some fancy like filters and widgets. Right? It's a dashboard with sliders and like no, okay. That to me is just a fancy dashboard. Like that's like a gossed up dashboard. It's like, okay, it doesn't really, yeah. The thing that I think of, when I think of a data app, I think of it as it is a tool that is meant to solve a problem which data is at its core, but primarily the tool is about solving this problem. And in a lot of ways, data is not necessarily going to be obviously surfaced in the app as like a dashboard or a chart or whatever. It's more that you cannot remove the data without destroying what the app does. And like the examples I have, I think I might be able to find a better specific. I like wrote something that I viewed as what I think this actually is. To me, the way that like this actually looks is like Yelp is a data app. It is a data app in that the whole thing Yelp does is it's designed to help you make a decision about where to go to eat or whatever, but you cannot do that without data. And it surfaces the data to you in a way, as this describes here, to help you understand and make and implement decisions. And that doesn't mean it's like a dashboard where you're doing analysis. It just means that data is like integrated into that experience such that you cannot remove data from Yelp, and Yelp still exists. Like Yelp does not exist without the review data underneath it. It's not a product without that. Whereas a tool like Asana exists with like, if you sort of think of data as like the transactional data that is actually underneath the Asana application, sure, Asana doesn't exist without that.
Like Photoshop or Figma might be a better extreme example.
Yeah, but even though, like, sure, like Figma has to know the data of like, what is your configuration? And there's like tables behind that, but that's not really, it's not a data app. Like a data app to me is something like Salesforce is starting to get in the middle ground, because like, is Salesforce a data app? Maybe. It certainly could operate, you know, like, but to me, I think
it's an agglomeration of a bunch of little data apps.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But to me, I think that's the key thing, is it's not a dashboard. It could be, if that's the best way to help people make a decision. Like weather.com is a data app, or Dark Sky is a data app. And those things are displays of data, because that's the best way to understand that and make decisions about whether I was taking an umbrella with me or not. But that also, a data app could also be a website that you say, should I take an umbrella or not? And it just tells me yes or no. And that's it. And as long as it gets it right often enough, that's still a data app to me.
Arguably, you know, an Alexa alert that says, take an umbrella.
Exactly.
Like
so
here's the interesting part for me is I feel like the key word here is actually decisions. And you know, there's two parts of that. One is that, like, in the future, as AI gets better and better, I think for the foreseeable future, we will still want to know at least that a human made a decision, so we have somebody to hold responsible for it. And I think, to me, there's a distinction between sort of decision making and sort of self-expression, right? When I'm writing a blog post, I'm not trying to make a decision. I mean, I make a lot of decisions there, but that's not the point. The point is to do the creative act. And it almost starting to feel, I don't know if this is relevant or necessary, but there's almost like this bifurcation, and maybe there'll be an integration in the future, between things that, like, things that are really just about the decision and things that are about sort of creation or expression. And what's interesting to me is that all decision-making systems are turning into data apps in a way that wasn't the case in the past, you know, when people would flay a goat and examine its liver to make a decision. I mean, that's a sort of data app, but it's a very localized one.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, yes, I very much agree with that. I think that certainly, there is some esoteric debate to be had about, like, is it a difference of degree or a difference in kind of,
Right.
like, is the goat's liver a data app? Like, I guess maybe,
Yeah.
like, but yeah, I think that is generally
And maybe
agree with that.
a better way of putting it is that decisions used to be made extremely locally based on locally superficially visible information. And what's interesting now is that we now have this deep data well that we're drawing from for decision making.
Mhm.
That to me is the big difference between the goats and modern. I'm not sure we're making necessarily much better decisions, but at least we're drawing, at least we have the option of drawing on deeper levels of data. And I think the big point is that, like, how you present this to human beings is critically important for how digestible that data is. And so it seems like inevitably organizations and ecosystems that build great data apps so that people can make better decisions will inevitably outcompete those that do not.
Yeah, like there was a slightly uncomfortable question to me here.
Okay.
To what extent that is true? Like, I certainly think, seems like it should be, that there is there is taken as gospel a little bit in the data world, this notion that, like, data-driven companies make better decisions, and all of its sort of corollaries around people who make faster decisions, like that ultimately there is something here that is, the winners are these things. I'm like a little bit skeptical of that, of, like, kind of to your point of, like, do we actually make that much better decisions because we're not looking at the goat's liver versus the other stuff? We don't make that much, like, given the degree at which we should be making better decisions, I'm not sure that we actually do. But yes, I would generally say that, like, at least on the margins, people certainly make better decisions. There's certainly some places where those decisions are way better. My likelihood of taking an umbrella when I need to is certainly way higher than it would be if I, like, look out at the sky and be like, seems like rain. But yeah, that's a little bit more.
I sometimes draw a distinction between better data and more data. More data is not necessarily better.
For sure.
And, like, Apple is notoriously not data driven, even though it's data informed. And, but anyway, okay. So, but at least we're sort of operating in the same space. Okay. So the next bit was this kind of thinking about, so, like, if we can make, better data apps faster, we can get to better decisions, right? And this brought up this metaphor of Ruby on Rails, which I found very evocative. And, this idea that before Ruby on Rails, you had to learn Perl and CGI and SQL and PHP and, all these things. And, one of the things that Ruby did was really sort of be the one ring to bind them all. It was all Ruby. It was all domain specific languages embedded inside or built on top of Ruby. And instead of pulling everything together, it was the sort of a batteries included. At least that was the catchphrase they used back then. The other thing was it was really easy to shoot yourself in the foot. And one of the things that, I was pitching this to a friend of mine, he was, like, shocked to realize that Ruby on Rails was still around. But one of the reasons why is that I think David Hansen said that, a small team of novices can build a reasonable web app quickly and put it on the internet and not have it fall apart. And that, like, and not have it hacked within 3 seconds of going live, because Ruby's embodied all of that knowledge for you. Rails has. Similarly, the idea is that, like, before, if you wanted to say, oh, it's a really good idea to do tests, I should set that up, you had to do it. Whereas, like, with Rails Gen, like, you're doing tests whether you want to or not, and you have to actually opt out of doing things the best way, which is fascinating to me. And, everything is going from where everything's sort of a bespoke web app, a bespoke app, to, convention over configuration, everything just works. And of course, the whole open source revolution, where you can just build on other people's best understanding of a problem. And the big one for me, I think, is that in order to get from a prototype to production, you needed multiple experts. You needed a database administrator, you needed a security researcher, you needed a web designer. And the beauty of a Rails app is something that you can just ship it by yourself, whether internally or externally. And then if it actually works or actually has some traction, then you can bring in the real pros to make it work better. And that's kind of this vision of what web apps that translates. Is that resonating with you at all?
Yeah, yeah, and this is I would generally agree with most of this. The one other thing too that this was something I was talking to someone a few years ago about, that I would say that is, I mean, it's kind of tied up in this, but to say more explicitly is that the way that the things that you focused on as a developer changed, or the things that differentiated you as a developer changed, where the people that we want to hire, the people that we wanted to hire as like Rails engineers are people who understand the products they're building. Like, you are less concerned, certainly as it scales and as you get to these, like, you have to hire specialists over time to deal with the stuff that's going to start to break. Absolutely. But the thing that like differentiates different Rails apps is not the quality of their underlying tech. It's basically like who understands the product more. And so I think there's a little bit of a movement up the stack essentially of the domain, the things that people need to understand, where it's like to hire an engineer who just has some deep understanding of how to build databases isn't that useful anymore, because you can just do it in the app directly. What you actually want is an engineer who understands the business problem that this app is supposed to solve and has to make 1,000 tiny decisions every day that will make that app a little bit better for the end user, rather than 1,000 tiny decisions a day that make the database slightly more performant. Now, at some point that doesn't work and you have to have everybody kind of everywhere, but generally my like view of it is that it made the best engineers, at least in the early stages of it, the ones that could use this framework to build really useful products, as opposed to the ones who could solve like, okay, we're able to solve some of the hard technical problems because this kind of abstracted a lot of those away.
Right, yeah, and DHH uses the phrase semantic compression. Is that like, you don't have to understand everything, you just say, I want, email, I want delayed jobs, I want file uploads, and you just say add file uploads, done. Yeah. And like that works for the 80% case, and sometimes that's all you need to get going and get to the next level. And right, and that's been, and so the implicit part of this, which you may have already picked up on, is that the left column is kind of my critique of data today. Right, we're all writing SQL and Python and CSVs and YAML files. We have to pull together 5 different tools. It is so easy to put in a wrong comma and break your entire pipeline and create bad data at the board meeting that you end up regretting for the next quarter. Not that I've ever done that. Like, if you want to try and do things the right way, it's a huge uphill slog. And everything feels like a bespoke project. You're starting over from scratch each time. And you have to rely on a data engineer and an analytics engineer and a data analyst to like get anything done. And I think, the point that's made this poignant for me is that I'm starting to realize that every business problem, and I don't know when this changed, but every business problem has turned into a data integration problem. Like, it used to be just at Wall Street where like every product was a data product. But now I feel like, and I don't remember it being this way, maybe because it was localized, but every cross-functional thing I do turns into this huge data brawl, I guess is probably the unkind way to put it. Whereas like, in order to do this project, like, you have to define a data model and you have to get everyone to collaborate around that shared data model, or literally nothing gets done. And it seems like it didn't used to be that way, but it seems like that's the way it is now. Have you seen any of this? Oh, you know what it used to,
I don't know that I'm quite.
I know why it's different now. It used to be, we had a project manager with a spreadsheet who was the point of integration, who knew everybody, who knew all the work that needed to be done. and they were the point of coordination. And now we don't have enough project managers to do that. I don't know if we fired them or if they're spread too thin or what. And so the only way we're able to get things done now is if we have a data-driven workflow to coordinate the work.
And I would say the way that I see this, it's a little bit of a, I've never thought of this before, but it's a little bit of a stupid problem maybe. Like it feels like there is an increasing desire to integrate this stuff and do so in a way that is like scalable and is correct. And we sort of build the right pipelines that all operate together. And like, for example, I'm thinking about, we have like a developer operations. It was probably like an EPD operations, basically a couple of folks at Mode that do this, who are basically tasked with coordinating across the entire department about, okay, who's working, making sure things aren't overlapping, making sure like things are moving correctly. Like there's just a lot of kind of coordination work that has to get done there. It's project management work, basically. You know, to understand who's working on what, how are we sort of doing on the velocity targets that we have, all that kind of stuff. The problem here is that this is a data problem. And it's not actually, I mean, it is, but people like know that data is a way to solve it, and therefore they make it a data problem instead of saying like, I'm just going to try to solve this however I can. That because it feels like the ceiling has gotten higher, it has raised the floor for what people view as being like necessary to solve this problem. I don't know that's actually true. I don't know that we need to do all of that, but because we can see like this much higher ceiling of what's possible, there is a sense of, well, we need to end it. Like, I can't do my job unless all this stuff is integrated together. And it's like, well, people have actually done this job for decades with none of this stuff being integrated together. Yet now that we can, we have this kind of assumption that that is what we have to do. And so I think like,
yeah, I think there's two things going on. I just put in the chat that it's harder than ever to get people to coordinate and easier than ever to get data to coordinate. And I don't know why the first one is true. Part of it is velocity, part of it is agility. Like before, when you had like a project that took, you know, a year, then ramping up a person and a bureaucracy and a program management staff to drive everything made a lot of sense. When you have a week to get the project launched because the project is going to be done in 1 month, like if you don't have a good, you know, automated data workflow, you're kind of screwed. And I think the kinds of problems we're taking on in the scope and the tolerances seem to be driving us toward this. I don't know exactly why, but it seems to be happening.
I would actually, I think there's an interesting point in that, but I would actually say, I would in some ways ascribe the causality in the opposite direction. Mm-hmm. I think that it is harder to get people to coordinate because it is easier to get data to coordinate. Like we now have dashboards for a bunch of people and they don't look the same. And so people are going to fight about that rather than just being like a project manager who has, yeah, they got their Excel spreadsheet that nobody questions because that's the one person whose job is to tell us what it is.
Right.
Now it's like, oh, but I have my Asana thing and you've got your GitHub issues and I've got this and we've got this dashboard. And like, we can't all agree because we're all looking at 40 different views of the world. Instead of somebody just saying, forget all that. My spreadsheet is your view of the world. That's the truth. And like,
yeah, and this is the sort of going from sort of the classical world of there's just, you know, a single God emperor who has all the truth to modernity of the, you know, mess of markets and independent states to trying to work our way back towards some sort of integrated global economy.
Yeah, like there's probably some ideal in which the latter case there actually becomes something that is more coordinated because we're all like tied to some ground truth that we can all see and we all exactly agree on. But the path to get there is probably everybody has their own view of the world. And that is a path that is just chaos. And it feels like that's actually closer to where we are now. And so it's actually harder to make people coordinate in that world than just like, well, what do we agree on? Well, we read, you know, our various religious texts and that's all we ever can agree on, but that's fine because it's not that long anyway.
Yes. So, okay, we could go off on a whole other tangent there, but I'll keep going back to the slides so I don't rat hole myself. All right. So the idea is, oh yeah, this is from the, I think, continual AI, right? Where it's almost possible to find an end-to-end data workflow declaratively. And this was the interesting challenge statement that I was thinking about. And that's where, like, okay, if we accept that that's sort of the challenge, I'm trying to move away from problem solving language to more challenge response language. And this is the thing that I wanted to pitch you, is this thing called Cqml. And the basic idea is using data to code web, actually, I think using data, I got my brain farted in there, is using data to code data apps. And this was something that I thought about for a while, and is tied to some of the reasons I left Apple to go to a startup. But then suddenly I faced this thing where we had a critical deliverable as a company, and suddenly I needed to spin up a data platform in like a week or two, more or less from scratch, not having had a data team or been a data person before. Although we've been playing around with it for a couple of months, so it was a good time to take the leap. And in order to just maintain my own sanity, which is a marginal proposition at best, I said, I need to find a better way to manage the code I'm writing. And this is what I came up with. So kind of so Cqml is this idea of a, oops, wrong button. Composable query meta language. The idea is that, and I fell in love with YAML, which is this sort of Python-esque data structure equivalent, to CSON, JSON, right? Which is very related to, similar to the property lists that Next Step introduced that worked their way into Java and elsewhere, which was surprisingly not really a common data structure before then. For interesting reasons. And I became sort of a data format geek. My one claim to fame is that I helped author the podcast RSS specification when I was at Apple. And so ever since then, I've had this fascination with data formats. And the big insight, the key insane epiphany I had that led to me leaving Apple and wandering in the wilderness these last 7 years is that there is no good reason for programming languages to have syntax. Is that there's this whole Chomsky hierarchy, and like all this LLR parsing, and it suddenly occurred to me, and I've kind of proved it in practice, but not yet in theory, which is that you just need a sufficiently rich data structure. And the idea is that programs are basically documents. It means programming languages are insanely difficult document formats, except for Lisp, which is an insanely difficult data format. And that you
could you say that again?
No, I won't say that again. And that I could do everything. So basically, I was writing all this Python code over and over again to try and do these merges and pull my NetSuite data and match it up with business data and with all the other labels and strings, so I didn't have all these random IDs floating around in my code. And I just writing the same Python code over and over again. And I said, wait, I could just pass the same data structure to one function, because I was trained in Ruby on Rails and write mod, and like the obsession of the Ruby community, which they may carry to a fault, is readability. Like the most readable code is the best code because it's semantically compressed. It says what you mean, what you're thinking when you read it. And Python notebook code is rarely readable. And well, after a certain scale is also not readable. And actually, interestingly enough, for the exact same reason that Lisp is not readable. If you've heard of Lisp, I don't know if you've had that. Yeah. And the thing about Lisp is that you get a single sentence that takes a page. And if you have a really sophisticated brain, you can glance at that and understand it. But for most of us, like if I get more than 3 nestings in an SQL clause, my brain explodes. And I said, yeah, and the idea is that, well, readability is basically having short sentences that are semantically compressed. And the idea is that if you can break down any complicated expression into a short series of data structures, which makes it easier for humans to read, but also trivial for machines to read. And any machine, not just the one parser built by this guy 20 years ago or 50 years ago, like SQL, but like anybody can read a YAML document and write code to parse it and do stuff with it. And this is the thing that, part of my conceit is that, lots of people try to make visual programming tools. My thesis is that the fatal flaw is they start from the UI and work down. And the better way to do it is start from the file format and work up. Because if you have the right semantics in your file format, then it's trivial to write a round-tripping piece of code, a GUI that'll work with it. So that's the idea, and that it spans all the different pieces of the ecosystem, pulling in data, doing all the transformations, specifying the visualizations, and then managing distribution as just a single format with a single tool chain, so I can go in one place, change one thing, and away it goes. And so that was the concept. And then I ended up, building a prototype of this just to try and get, out of the hole that our company was in. And this is just a little teaser of what it looks like. It's got, a YAML dictionary, it's got a version, you have a bunch of metadata about the different systems that you need to be able to integrate with. And then you say, read a file, and then do a select statement, and then merges, queries, etc. And like, this is what I am like doing to do my day job, or at least 1/3 of my day job, which is being the data team at Notto. And that's, it's built on top of Databricks and PySpark. We use Quilt, a data catalog, as our distribution mechanism and sort of administrative console. One of the fun things that we had to do was generate box files for our customers. And so, like, I have no idea how normal people solve the problem of building a daily data pipeline that has to output a box file. But the way I did it was by adding a new action under, which was like do box, and then say, like, take this data file, split it up by this, by customer ID, and then spit it out into all these box files, and then sync that data into a table that got pushed to Salesforce so that Marqeta can email those files out to customers. And the idea is that, that I just have one file I need to maintain. And oh, by the way, when they say, oh, by the way, we need to change the file format, I use a completely different algorithm, I just change one action in my pipeline and everything else just works. And I've started adding tests. I have one for uniqueness because we kept having like errors where we would have multiple copies of things because I did my merges wrong. And so, and that's like something that one thing that I've learned, I was around before test-driven development and extreme programming. And like, I remember what that world was like. And, going back into SQL is like living in that world again, where I have no idea if my code is right or if I've broken something horrible. And I haven't yet, like DBT does a lot of this, but I haven't actually had the time, even though I desperately want to, just write the DBT backend that would take these files and generate all my DBT files and tests. I'm still not sure in the back of my mind whether that's necessary or whether this replaces DBT. I'm just trying to survive. And this is kind of a chance to talk about it with someone who understands this problem space. So that was really all the slides I had. I think I had, this is just, we talked about data apps as not just a dashboard. And so this is the incredibly minimalist, simplest possible idea of a data app. But this is the idea that, like, this is a Quilt package which has this data grid built into it. And I added a new module, which is do report, where I can give it a list of widgets. And then it'll give me a pop-up list where I can sort on this thing. Because having a data grid like this was too intimidating for my business users.
Yeah.
But if I say there's a pop-up here, go to this pop-up and click on it and just choose your fleet and you're done. That's at the level of Google Data Studio. that's something that people can do. And that in theory, I could just add more widgets and layouts, and we can start iterating towards it. The main thing for me is that, at least personally, inside this single paradigm of just YAML files, actions, and pipelines, I can just add one really simple thing and say, do report, add this widget. And I don't have to learn py widgets and import statements and all this other syntax and all this other paradigms. I can do something really simple. And, of course, it's very limited. But, in theory, like if I need to do something new, I have to learn how to do that. And then I create an action for it. And then I forget about it. Like I literally am unable to write PySpark today because I forget how to load a table because I've abstracted it away so much that it's easier to just spin up a YAML file and put it in a new project and run away. And so I'm able to forget all these things that I really wish I didn't have to know. Like, oh, what is the proper order to say order by versus group by when you're doing a SQL statement? I lost an hour trying to do that in a SQL editor because I've forgotten that. And some people get appalled at this forgetting, but to me, that's the power. So anyway, that's what I wanted to just kind of share with you. This is actually all live. It's a pip module. If anyone feels like playing it, as part of my insanity, I ended up writing my own version of Make to manage all these things called YMM. And so you can install that, and you can build, test, and install this thing, and run a little sample app. It'll not do a whole lot, especially if you don't have Quilt installed, but it's there. And this is basically just, I believe that this problem of data apps is a huge opportunity, right? It's not going to solve all the world's problems. I have a few other startups working on the rest of that, which we could talk about some other time if you're curious. But having a robust data infrastructure is, I think, makes other problems much easier to solve compared to having a broken one or an unreliable one. And so that's like the thing that, and so this is the idea. And so this is the big idea that could a declarative, one YAML file to bind them all be a way to get us past the SQL local minima that we're stuck at, which was the blog post that you wrote that really prompted me to reach out to you. And not so much of a yes or no, but like, well, maybe, but these are the big questions or hard problems that this proposal brings up.
So I think I have three like immediate thoughts. One is, can we get out of, are we in a like local minimum or local maximum rather with the state of SQL essentially? And I think actually probably yes. Which I say is someone who like builds a very SQL heavy product.
I just have to say that deeply, deeply impressed me that a person whose company is built around SQL was willing to question the land that they stand on. Most people, I've been an activist and an entrepreneur inside and outside of places. When you question the validity of people's foundations, they don't tend to react well. So I really admire you're doing that.
We'll see if it was a savvy business decision or not. But and I don't think that like SQL's not going to go away tomorrow. But I do think it's like we're putting a lot into it. We're doing a lot of crazy stuff with it now. And I think that like there is it's like getting overextended in all sorts of weird ways. In that post, I think so first thought I guess would be, does something like this help us move away from it? Maybe, though I think that there are probably two big problems tied up here. One of, and like they're adjacent but not the same thing. One is like the thing that post was more about, which is like the business logic part of essentially defining how we've got a whole bunch of tables in a warehouse. sure, you've got them modeled in various ways. You've got your star schemas or whatever sort of like, database organization principles that sort of your particular flavor that you choose following. That there is some way to translate that into what your business actually wants the data to become. And SQL is kind of bad at that. And one of the things that someone actually posted in one of the comments that I like regret not bringing up more in the post was, if you ever have like transactional data and you're trying to build any kind of like time series with it in SQL, it is a nightmare. Like it is the most obvious thing that you would ever do is like, give me a list of customers. Now turn this into a daily revenue chart. It's really hard. And like SQL itself to me does a really bad job of that. And I think that I think something like what Malloy is trying to do is kind of interesting, because I actually see this as being somewhat similar to Malloy.
Yeah, it's very similar. Like the idea itself is not new. The idea of doing it using a data structure rather than a language is what's new.
Yeah, and like I like the idea of it being one of the things when I saw Malloy for the first time was kind of cool was it is like declarative business logic. It is because like right now it's like, sure, okay, it's defined in SQL, but in some ways SQL gets so complicated that like, yes, technically it is declarative, but you're actually kind of there's like a procedural element around it. We're trying to understand, okay, what does this table do? What does this table do? You're having to construct the logic out of a series of tables. No, it doesn't really say like, what I want really is a way to, in plain English, specify what is the way that my business works and describe it to someone and have the computer understand what to do with it. And like something like,
let me just change that to precise English rather than plain English.
Yes, sure. Yes.
Which is where SQL looks like plain English.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Which is where it gets messy. Yeah,
and it makes it
hard to be precise.
Yeah, and it has to be precise because like these issues are issues of precision. Now the other thing I would say though is I think there are two pieces of this, which is there is like the semantic model of the data itself, and then there is the Rails side of the application. And like I think those are separate, probably. Like the Rails analogy to me falls down a little bit in this regard, where the Rails application and the semantics of like what is happening in the underlying data model in Rails are basically the same. Like it's not exactly, but the Rails application is it is the model, like the model underneath, like it is part of the, you have to define the model of how your data is all connected. And then, you get things like active record on top, and active record is basically your data model. And it's like the logic of the application is the same as the Rails application in a lot of ways.
Right.
In data apps, that's not true. In data apps, you have a bunch of like raw data that's generated by your systems and sucked into a warehouse. Those things don't strictly define that. Like you have to basically say, okay, what is a customer? What is a user? What is a purchase? What is our revenue? And then the data app itself can actually be an additional layer on top of that. That is, how do we display this to people? How do we make it useful? Like, what is the information that people want to see when? That is in some ways a little bit independent of the actual definition of the data itself. Like you are having to source external data, reformat it into something that makes sense for the data app. And then the data app actually probably has its own, like a little bit of internal logic that actually makes sense of how it gets displayed. Whereas in Rails, you're not sourcing from an external source. Like the underlying model is itself designed to power the app. Where in data apps, the underlying model is actually, it's an external thing that has to be sort of reformatted to fit the app. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think this is I think someone calls this the Ouroboros problem, is where your snake's eating its own tail. In that, or the Ouroboros solution is that the idea, well, so the way that Cqml is implemented underneath is that everything is a data frame, right? So every little action by default creates its own data frame and it cascades along. You can compile them down so that you can be more efficient and things like that. The interesting idea, and like in order for this idea to work, you have to get this sort of dual property where Cqml can both describe an existing data model and fully describe the transformations you do to that, and fully describe the way that the user experiences the data. Those are three different things today. And the hypothesis, if you will, is that those could all become a single semantic model, a semantic meta model, if you will, that's rich enough to encode all of those. And this is the sort of thing that sounds better after a few beers, but this is what I was trained to do as a physicist, is to look at these large, and my 2 years as a management consultant, is look at this large mass of data and all these stovepipe verticals, Newton looking at, an apple falling from the tree and the comet going through the sky, and say, what if we could come up with a single universal abstraction that was rich enough to actually do all of those things, so it becomes like one discipline, which I don't even have a name for it yet. And then all these other things get reinterpreted as specialized use cases. So like the dream, right? And I'll tell this to you because you're a courageous man that I admire, is that mode becomes, either directly or indirectly, and this may be 5 or 10 years, right? I'm really good at coming up with ideas and really bad at figuring out how they're going to play out over time. That the, two things would happen. One is that like, everyone's already starting to write YAML files in GitHub as their configuration. I know HighTouch does. I don't know if Mode does that yet, but like, it would be trivial for this thing to end up just spitting out YAML files for the configuration, right? So right now, like I create a bunch of stuff and then I manually go into HighTouch and set up all my reverse ETL. It would be the work of a weekend to just add a, thing that says like taking this model and then just generate the mapping. And the hard part is all the keeping track of all the column names from Salesforce and NetSuite, so you know which things to map from which to which, but it's all there. And the next stage is to write a linter to do that, check it for me, and the next stage is to build a GUI that does it there. But the idea is that, is really this issue of semantic compression, is the idea that we don't have data app developers today. We have people who build different pieces of that system. And if something is wrong somewhere down in the base thing, you have to wait for the guy in the database to add a row or the analytics engineer to add a metric before your front end guy can build the widgets. Or you have to switch between 3 different tools to do it. And it's possible, at least for me, to imagine a world where one person can span that whole semantic space because we've abstracted away that complexity onto a common set of interfaces. And once you do that, then you get the idea of, well, then I can build, it's just YAML files. Anybody can build can parse a YAML file and build their own custom UI saying, well, I want to look at it this way or present it this way or make a Slack message or an Alexa alert out of that. And then we end up refactoring the entire ecosystem around, well, I guess this is probably the right metaphor. I'm dreaming of building the HTML for the data web. Is that this idea of a YAML structure with a finite set of actions becomes this thing that anyone else can build everything on, but because it shares these primitives, it becomes an ecosystem rather than just a single application.
So yeah, so that's sort of the thing that we're like probably gonna confuse myself with analogies, but I think that is getting close to what my view here would be, which is this is closer to like HTML. It's closer to saying, hey, you want to build a data app, we give you all of these tools to let you do it. We give you sort of a common way to specify it. It's very easy to do. There is a layer beneath that is like the semantic model of the data itself that I do think it could be tied to that, but it doesn't have to be. Like, it doesn't have to be bound to, like, HTML can work in Rails, it can work in Django, it can work in whatever else. Like, the point is, it is a specification that doesn't care about the underlying data model, having stuff that helps you with the underlying data model can integrate really tightly with, like, you can do a lot with those things together, but HTML on its own can stand, like, it can stand on its own. It can stand on something that's just a bunch of CSVs. Like, you don't actually need all of this other complexity underneath it. And I think that the semantic way to model data and to, like, model business logic is hard enough that it feels like a lot to attempt to do, like, to your physics analogy, to have, like, the sort of grand theory that unifies everything. I don't know enough about physics to quite make this, but you've got, like, the planetary physics and then, like, the like particle physics, and we haven't quite made those match exactly yet. And, like, it's going to be hard to make those match. Like,
well, yeah, well, I think the thing that's my other project, but that's probably a little bit further out. I've been doing a weird deep dive this last week on quantum gravity and stuff like that, because I got sucked back into a Caltech alumni event. Anyway, the interesting idea is that I have a thesis for what a semantic model is. And this is actually the feature request I had for Mode that they never got back to me on, interestingly enough, which is, I don't even know if there's an industry standard term for this. I call it rebinning. And that's where I have a column, which is like, let's say it's states. And I have a column which is population. And I want to create a rebinning where I want to have, big states, medium states, and little states. And I want to be able to say, take these, 10 dimensions here and these 50 dimensions here. Actually, no, take this continuous value here and this set of 50 discrete values here, and recategorize them into these 3 buckets. And I couldn't figure out any way to do that with the Mode GUI, or even to explain it to them in a way that made sense to the people I was talking to.
Yeah, like out of, I mean, there are ways to do that in, like, basically if statements. Like,
so here's the thing. This is the thing that, so to me, and this gets into some deep cognitive questions. To me, that is what a semantic model is. It is saying, taking these different ground realities and compressing them into semantically meaningful concepts. My favorite is how red and green in the brain turn into yellow. And so, as part of, like, and it wasn't a conscious thing, but, like, I ran into this problem and 2 things happened. One is I solved it using this YAML data structure. It's a really simple, elegant thing where you do these mappings. And so that was one exciting thing. The second thing, which is really fascinating to me, and I don't know if this is true in general, is every project since then, the way that I have reached agreement with stakeholders is to create that rebinning semantic chart, where I say, okay, these are the primitive elements in our universe here, our atoms and molecules. And if I can map the decision problem you're facing onto that set of molecules, I have solved the business problem. That is my semantic model. Is this, in fact, rebin function that takes, which is basically just a series of where statements, right? It's a label, where, this, there, and having that all as, like, a single simple tree feels to me like that might be the semantic model. I can't prove that. I don't even know what a semantic model is defined as, but at least in practical terms, it feels like that is what we mean by semantics, right? It's like, what is, we find words that mean something to us, or colors, or whatever. That is the, and, like, one can argue this is actually the decision problem, right? In order to make a decision, we have to, like, collect a bunch of data and then normalize it into, like, okay, I really care about religious holidays or South Park videos, which is one thing I love in your blog post. I never know when I click on something whether I'm going to get Easter or Kenny dying. There's probably a loop in there somewhere about Kenny being resurrected, but I haven't hit that.
Sure.
Yeah, but the idea is that being able to re-aggregate data into the smallest set of concepts so that I can reason about them deeply is an interesting definition of wisdom as opposed to a mere intelligence. Although frankly, business intelligence is kind of the same thing, right? It's trying to take this massive quantity of data and represent it in terms that are emotionally evocative. Ooh, that's a better way of putting it. Turning information into emotion. You've heard that there's a great phrase I heard that words are crystallized emotions.
Yeah, and I sort of like that as a ultimately that's all a semantic model is basically doing, is it's taking a whole bunch of like tiny grains of sand that we can't make any sense out of and turning it into something that like we can reason about and look at and be like, oh, this is a sandcastle. But yeah, I know, but how I don't know. There are a lot of people who seem to be trying to take, not a lot, there's a handful of people who are taking these like slightly different approaches in terms of how we actually go about doing this. And I think I am with you that I think I'm with you on these points. I'm with you on the point of like the need for that and that kind of expression. I'm with you on, I think this like data app imperative is like, this is how this is going to work. I guess my biggest question would mostly be, how conjoined are those two things? Is the data app imperative the same as like solving these semantic problems? Like, yes, in one sense that like, to me, they're inseparable and that you can't really do one without the other. But does that mean it's all like sort of done in this one, as you said, like, is the physics analogy right where it needs to be done in one kind of unifying theory, or is it something where we actually can explain it in 2 steps?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And I think it's easier to solve than quantum gravity.
Should be.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you. We are over time. It's getting close to the top of the hour. I am sure you have a very busy life. I guess 2 requests. One is just for my own archival purposes. I recorded this. How would you feel about me turning this into something that could be published externally?
I didn't say anything that I would disagree with. I mean, it depends on how exactly you want to distribute it, but just I'm not generally opposed.
Okay, I can put it up as a private link and send it to you first. I have a Designing Human Systems YouTube channel I created a while ago, which has a bunch of random conversations like this about different things in the dataverse and philosophy and computer science. And I guess the second question is, can you think of somebody else that I should have this conversation or a related conversation with to just help me flesh out my ideas more fully?
Who else is on this? Let me think. I can get back to you on that.
Sure.
Let me think about that a little bit. I'm sure there are folks. I'm trying to think of who's the data app thing is something that certainly there's like folks who seem to be interested in talking about, but I can think of who's had stuff to say about that recently that might be interesting.
Yeah. Worst case, I'll just throw it up on the DBT Slack and see who.
Yeah, and it is like, to your point, it is something that is like pretty buzzy and popular at the moment. So I would be surprised if there's not people who would be very interested in learning more about it, especially because partly kind of what you were saying, like they're hard to build. People seem to think they're important. Nobody really knows what they are. It feels a little bit like a space that is like, in some ways, right for the taking for whoever it is that just stands up and says, this is the flag I'm sticking in the ground, let's all gather around it. Because right now it's kind of a lot of people wandering, being like, what is it? Like looking for a little bit of the people wandering in the dark looking for the street light.
Yeah. All right, now we're going to get into Christmas analogies if you're not careful. All right. Well, God bless you. Thank you so much for your time, and I will send you a link sometime soon.
Sounds good. Thanks. I'll think about some names.
Yeah. Also, do you want to review the link before I post it publicly, or is it okay if I just throw it up there and let you know?
Was it going like a YouTube thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably fine.
All right. Great. Thank you. It's nice working with the CEO who doesn't have to get permission.
Yeah. All right. See ya.
Bye.